Think about this. A king with, absolute power, the kind you read about, and he just decides to give it up willingly.
It sounds, well, almost unbelievable, doesn't it?
Right, but that's exactly the story we're diving into today, the really fascinating case of Bhutan.
Mm-hmm. That kingdom nestled way up in the Himalayas,
Yeah.
famous maybe for gross national happiness.
Yes, but maybe less known for its equally incredible political journey, shifting from absolute monarchy to democracy, started by the monarch himself.
It's quite the story.
Precisely. So we've got some really interesting material here looking at Bhutan's history, how this happened, and right at the center, the fourth king.
A pivotal figure.
Absolutely. So our mission, let's say, for this deep dive is to try and understand why. Why would a ruler with seemingly all the power choose to hand it over? And, how did this actually play out in Bhutan?
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. The Wangchuck dynasty. Our sources say it was formally set up back in 1907. King Wangchuck, the first hereditary king.
Right, unifying the country. Before that, it was more fragmented, lots of local rulers.
Exactly. Centuries of that. So this unification under one authority, well, it laid a foundation, didn't it?
Yeah, it creates that sense of national identity, a starting point.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that stability was, well, crucial for everything that followed.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get the third king, Jigme Wangchuck. He's the father of the fourth king we mentioned, reigned until 72, and he starts making changes.
Big changes. Abolishing feudalism, for one.
Huge. And bringing in roads, schools, hospitals, the kind of infrastructure of a modern state, really.
He's definitely starting to open Bhutan up, laying down those physical and social tracks for development. And importantly, he set up the Chogdu, the National Assembly, way back in 1953.
53. Wow.
That wasn't, a parliament like we think of today, not at all. But what kind of idea do you think that planted?
It introduces representation, doesn't it? Some kind of body beyond just the king himself. It's a tiny step, maybe, towards participation, even if the king still held most of the cards.
A seed, yeah.
And that brings us to Jigme Singye Wangchuck, the fourth king, takes the throne in 72, very young, just 16.
Remarkable.
And the sources really hammer home that his reign was driven by two, well, pretty revolutionary ideas for a monarch.
Yes, the first one being gross national happiness, GNH.
Which everyone's heard of, but maybe doesn't fully grasp.
Possibly. It's more than just a slogan. It genuinely shifted the focus from just GDP, economic growth at all costs,
Right.
to prioritizing the overall well-being of the people, holistically. So culture, environment, good governance, equitable development, it's all in there.
So how does that kind of thinking maybe influence how you think about governing?
Well, if your goal is broader happiness, maybe, just maybe, a system where people have more say perhaps aligns better, rather than just top-down rule.
Interesting connection. And the second big idea was...
Democratization, straight up. He genuinely believed democracy was crucial for Bhutan's long-term stability and, very importantly, protecting its sovereignty.
And what's so striking, that sources point this out, is that this wasn't because people were demanding it, right? There weren't huge protests like you saw in other places.
Exactly. That's what makes it so unique. This seemed to come from the king's own analysis of Bhutan's future needs. It wasn't a reaction. It was a proactive vision.
So it's this pretty radical idea, especially coming from him. How did he start making it real? What were the steps?
Well, it wasn't overnight. The sources show a very gradual, phased approach. Starting in the 80s and 90s, he pushed for decentralization.
Okay, what did that look like?
Giving more power, more autonomy to local governments. The dzongkhags and giwogs, the districts and blocks. Think like local councils getting more responsibility.
Why start local, do you think?
Well, it's like training wheels, maybe. Giving people practical experience in governance right there in their communities. It builds capacity, fosters ownership.
Gets them ready for bigger things. Makes sense.
Yeah. And then in 1998, a really big move, the king voluntarily handed over his executive powers to the Council of Ministers.
Wait, so he stopped being the day-to-day ruler 10 years before the Constitution?
Pretty much. He became more like a head of state, less the head of government. It effectively made Bhutan a de facto constitutional monarchy, even before it was official.
What kind of message does that send?
A huge one. It showed he was serious. Not just talk. He was actually stepping back, letting others manage the daily running of the country. It was like a real-world pilot test.
Okay. So decentralization, then handing over executive power. What's next?
The Constitution. Drafting Bhutan's first ever written constitution, starting around 2001, a committee was set up.
And what was their job, basically?
To create this fundamental law, laying out how elections would work, the role of political parties, checks and balances, and crucially, limits on the king's own power.
The act of writing it down, that feels significant in itself for a transition like
Oh,
this.
absolutely. It's about establishing the rule of law over the rule of, well, one person, creating a stable, predictable framework that everyone, including the monarchy, has to follow, moving from personal rule to institutional rule.
But here's something amazing the sources highlight. In 2005, they actually released the draft constitution to the public for feedback.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the king asking the people, "So, what do you think of this document that changes my power and gives you rights?" How unusual was that?
Highly unusual, especially for a monarchy with such deep roots. It shows, I think, a real desire for this constitution to be seen as legitimate by the Bhutanese people themselves, for it to reflect their values.
So it wasn't just imposed.
No, that public consultation was key for getting people on board, building buy-in.
Okay, so we see the how, but let's dig into the why again. Our sources seem to point to four main reasons driving the fourth king. First, long-term stability.
Right. He wasn't blind to what was happening elsewhere. The
Yeah.
sources mentioned Nepal, where the monarchy fell. He seemed worried that absolute rule, and even benevolent rule, might eventually face challenges in Bhutan too.
So he saw democracy as more stable in the long run.
It seems so. Like institutionalizing governance, making it less dependent on one person, was the way to ensure lasting peace, thinking beyond his own reign.
That's quite forward-thinking. Second reason.
Empowering the citizens. He had that famous quote, didn't he? The destiny of the nation lies in the hands of the people.
Coming from an absolute monarch, that's
Yeah.
powerful. What do you take from that?
It just shows, I think, a profound respect for his people, a belief that they should shape their own future, and that a government accountable to them would ultimately be better for everyone. A real shift.
Okay. Third motivation. Sovereignty.
Yes, preserving sovereignty. Look at where Bhutan is squeezed between India and China. A very delicate position, always has been.
And how would democracy help with that?
The thinking seems to be that a democratic system, representing the people's will, would give Bhutan more legitimacy internationally, strengthen its standing, make it more resilient to external pressures.
Makes sense. A unified voice, legitimized by elections.
Something like that. And finally, the fourth point ties back to.
Gross national happiness.
Exactly. He saw democracy with its ideas of participation, accountability, good governance. He saw it as fitting perfectly with the core principles of G&H.
So G&H wasn't just about culture and environment. It was also about how the country was run.
Precisely. Good governance is one of the key pillars of G&H. So democracy becomes, in a way, a tool to help achieve that greater collective happiness.
Okay, so the motivations are clear, the steps were gradual. Then things really start moving fast in the mid-2000s. December 2006, the fourth king abdicates.
Yes, steps down in favor of his son, Jigme Singye Wangchuck, the current fifth king, who, notably, was educated abroad, including at Oxford.
Right, in democratic systems, what's the significance of that handover right then?
Well, it provided continuity, kept the respected monarchy in place, but brought in a new generation. A leader prepared, perhaps, for this new role of being a constitutional monarch, guiding the final transition steps.
Signaled a real shift while keeping tradition.
Yeah, a careful balancing act. Then, 2007, they held mock elections.
Mock elections, just for practice.
Exactly. To familiarize people with voting, with parties, the whole process. Interestingly, the sources say there was some hesitation. People were actually petitioning the fourth king not to give up power.
Really? Why?
Well, it shows the deep affection and trust they had in him, right? And maybe some nervousness about this new unknown system. Change is hard, even good change. The mock elections probably helped ease some of that.
Build some familiarity. Okay.
But things moved forward. March 24th, 2008, Bhutan holds its first real general election for the National Assembly.
Historic moment.
Absolutely. Two main parties competing, both generally pro-monarchy, actually, and one party, the Drukgyalsam Shokpa, or DPT, won by a landslide.
Wow. What was the impact of just having that election?
It was the concrete realization of the king's vision. The first time citizens directly elected their national leaders. A fundamental change in Bhutanese politics.
And the final piece?
July 18, 2008. The Constitution is formally enacted. That's the day Bhutan officially becomes a parliamentary constitutional monarchy.
The culmination of that whole long process.
Yes. Formalizing the new system, putting the legal framework in place.
So what does this new system look like? It's a constitutional monarchy, so the king is still head of state, right? A symbolic figurehead.
Yes, a very important, revered figurehead, but without executive power. The day-to-day governing, the lawmaking that rests with the parliament.
And parliament is bicameral, two houses.
That's right. You have the National Assembly, the Chogdu, with 47 members elected directly from constituencies, and then the National Council, the Gilyong Shogde.
How does that one work?
It has 25 members, 20 are elected from the districts, and 5 are appointed by the king. It acts as a sort of house of review, providing maybe more specialized input, a mix of elected and appointed.
Interesting blend. And the sources also mention some unique Bhutanese rules for politics, like about political parties.
Yeah, parties are required by law to promote national unity at G&H. You can't form a party based on region or religion, for example.
And criticizing the monarchy is off limits.
Correct. Given the history and the reverence, that's perhaps not surprising. It suggests Bhutan is really shaping democracy to fit its own context, its own values.
It's not just importing a Western model wholesale.
Definitely not. It's democracy with Bhutanese characteristics, you could say.
Of course, a big change like this.
Yeah.
It can't all be smooth sailing. The sources talk about some initial skepticism, people not trusting politicians.
Well, yeah, for generations, the king was the ultimate authority, the symbol of stability. Suddenly you have elected politicians, parties competing. It's a different dynamic. It probably took time for people to adjust to build trust in this new system.
Understandable. But the sources also say younger generations are more engaged with democracy now, though maybe voter turnout has dipped a bit since those first elections.
That's an interesting point. Lower turnout is something many democracies grapple with, isn't it? It could be disillusionment, feeling your vote doesn't count, lack of engagement, complex reasons. It's a challenge for Bhutan, like elsewhere.
And they're still figuring out that balance between modern democracy and, deep-rooted Buddhist traditions, like laws on religious conversion.
Absolutely. It shows it's an ongoing process, defining what modern Bhutan looks like while holding on to its unique cultural and spiritual identity. It's a balancing act.
So when you look back at the fourth king, his legacy is just, well, extraordinary, isn't it? Voluntarily giving up absolute power. The sources call it unprecedented in modern times.
It really is. It shows such a deep commitment to his country's well-being, prioritizing that over his own personal power. It's incredibly rare, earned him huge respect, obviously.
And even now, the monarchy is still deeply respected, right? The fifth king is active, involved. The sources call it democracy with a heart.
Yeah, it seems to provide that continuity, that stability, while the democratic institutions do the governing. It reflects Bhutan's very unique path-blending tradition and modernity.
We've got those two great quotes here. The fourth king, I would not like to rule a nation where the people are not happy. That really says it all about his motivation, doesn't it?
It really does. A profound sense of responsibility. Leadership isn't about holding power. It's about ensuring people's well-being, even if that means letting go.
And the fifth king's words, democracy is a journey, not a destination. We must walk this path together.
That emphasizes it's ongoing,
Right.
not a finished product. It requires constant effort, learning, participation from everyone.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, Bhutan's story is just remarkable. A king driving democracy. It really makes you think, doesn't it? About leadership, about what a nation should prioritize beyond just, the economy.
It really does. It makes you consider different ways political change can happen and the role of values like well-being, culture, citizen empowerment. Bhutan offers a really compelling and thought-provoking example for all of us, I think.
Exactly. It leaves you wondering how other societies find their own balance, between tradition and progress on their own journeys. Bhutan's way, it's certainly unique and, well, quite inspiring.